just walked in and I saw a lot of people in the back. And I would love to invite them to join us in the front. I won't ask any questions to the people in the front. I promise. I will ask questions to the people in the back. Get up and come in the front. Thanks. Yeah. Also, as a small pause, is it right that I have time until 11:15 in Canada? Do I have time until 11:15? I have half an hour? Including questions. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I'm actually a professor designing the future. It translates, I'm a lector, which is a professor of practice. So I work at an applied university in Tilburg. And what I do is I lead a research group in focusing on the future. And what I do is I focus on what can you do today. So today I will share my insights and hopefully practical tools for you to start working with that, also based on what you just heard from Rob and Peter. So I'm excited to work with you today. One of the topics that I love to work with is, what are the stories that we tell about the future? So, and you're all from different companies. I just heard some people from AMS-IX, but there are probably more companies, right? Organizations present? Yes. And what we all do in companies and organizations is creating visions, so plans for the next year. And you're actually already working with the future when you do that. So what I'm interested in is, what language do we use in those plans? What stories do we tell? And how can we actually be a little bit more aware of that? So on a personal level, what stories do you tell about your future? What stories does your organization tell? And also, what do we tell ourselves as a society? And I'm curious to find out about it because I have noticed, young and old, that we're actually kind of narrating similar stories. So one of the first stories I often hear that is quite more recent are stories about fire in the woods, stories about the climate. I recently, like last week, I saw an article in The Guardian written by, or scientists were interviewed about the state of the world, and they were really alarmed. And that made me really alarmed. And I also saw a picture of a lot of fire. So I was like, okay, this is definitely a big story that we are telling ourselves today. Another story is about flying cars, technology, and how it will save us. And the last story I hear a lot is Elon Musk. How can we get out of here? Let's go to Mars, right? So these are stories that are very familiar for us, but also for our kids, actually. I asked young kids, there were about 10, please create drawings for us. And I was actually surprised to see these stories come up there as well. So we're already sort of bringing them into a system of stories that may not be beneficial for us, actually. So I'm trying to emphasize, what stories are you telling? Especially because the question that I'm asked a lot currently is not, how can I do what you do, like as a futurist, that I will explain in a bit, but how can I deal with the hopelessness I experience? Which is quite a fundamental question to ask. And it says a lot about the stories that we're telling each other and how they make us feel. So I'm trying today to help you to formulate different questions about that future. So I'm very curious what you're going to ask me later. So what I do as a futurist is I am also working with scenario planning, I'm working with backcasting, but I'm also creating a philosophy of how can we look at the future. And why I do it is because I want to help you be informed to make better decisions today. So it's actually really about the now. For me, it's not about science fiction, about the future. It's really about what are we doing right now. That's the most important thing, because that has influence. Someone who backs me in this is William McCaskill. He wrote the book, What We Owe the Future. And this book is interesting because what he does is he really zooms out. He says, in like 10,000s of years, how will they look back at us? How will they look at us? And they will probably see us as one generation of 1,000 years. And he also says, we are the ancients. We are the people that came first. And he's also saying, like, the choices that we make today will impact them in that future. And he says, of course, make your choices wisely, choose wisely. But I'm also learning, okay, if we are like one really big generation, how do we want them to look at us from that future? And sometimes I'm a bit worried that they will be looking at us like this, distracted. So let's work on that today and see how far we will get. I'm going to bring as fast as I can, seeing the time, but I'm going to give you three quite concrete, practical tools and questions to work with. Reflective questions. I'm not going to ask you, only in the back maybe, but I'm not going to ask you, but I will ask you to ask them yourself. So these are reflective questions that you may be able to work with. But before I go into that, I will first show you one example of a future cone, we call this. And this is actually a way to look at how can you look at the future and how can you work with that future. So you see a really big round. It's like a sort of a light, like a shining light into the dark of the future. And you see a really big round with possible futures. And this is the domain of the people who are stretching our boundaries. The artists, the scientists, the pioneers, the people, the trailblazers, the people who are doing really new things because they believe in it. Sometimes you are one of them too, also on a smaller scale. We also work with preferable futures, and this is really important to remember that when, for example, you create a plan for the next year, an annual plan, or a vision for your company, a strategy, you are actually bringing in your norm. You are bringing in your perspective. Be really aware that in your company, but also in society, obviously, there's a lot of diversity in how people are looking at that future. And ask yourself, what do they need? So not just look at from your own perspective, but also from others. Because often we confuse this with, oh, I'm doing really new things with those possible futures, but keep them separated. Be aware of what you bring in yourself. Then we also have something as a probable future, and I see a lot of people are focusing on those because they're like, oh, that's perfect, then I will probably have something to hold on to in that future. But this is actually the biggest pitfall. If you work with probable futures, the things that you know, you will probably not be innovative at all, as we just heard. This is something that I find difficult as well. A neuroscientist once told me, our brain, our beautiful complex brain, is always on repeat. So it will repeat the past. It will repeat today into tomorrow, but it won't, for you, just change overnight. So you really need to actively work to open your brain for new possibilities. And I'll show you an example. Probably a familiar example for you. This is a picture of a computer in a whole room. And this computer, obviously in 43, someone else, or the boss of IBM was working on some other issues at that time. But he was definitely wrong about how he thought the computer would evolve. What I find interesting about it is you can laugh at it in hindsight, about these technological sort of forecasts or predictions. But actually, we all do this every day. So it's good to remember, like, we're all human, and we all have, like, we have to stretch ourselves to be able to imagine. So let me go into the three, tools, advices, questions that I'm going to ask you to help you prepare and adapt for that future. The first one is about our assumptions. So what do we think about that future? In the workshops that I facilitate, I often notice that the conversations about the future are quite short. They're not really in-depth. And I notice this because often I see people thinking about, okay, what is that future? What does it hold? Let me put in a statement, and then afterwards we will be able to discuss it. But what I notice is then often people are scared to sort of dive into that, to be explorative, and to not go into the assumptions of the other. So these conversations are often quite superficial. And I have noticed, like, okay, how can we start working with that? How can we actually maybe start with, okay, let's make a round and everybody who is going to discuss the future of education, the future of IT, let's just hear you out. What do you think about it? What is your future vision? So you can actually relate to where the other is at that moment. That can be really useful. An example of the power of words and the assumptions that we make. This is an advertisement of Patagonia, a sustainable brand. And they have advertised this in the New York Times. And they did this just right before Black Friday. And they wanted to make a statement. And you can read this statement in two ways. You can read it from the top to the bottom and from the bottom to the top. And I will do it for you to show you. We're all screwed. So don't tell us that we can imagine a healthy future. Because the reality is, it's too late to fix the climate crisis. And we don't trust anyone who says we need to demand a livable planet, because we don't have a choice. Because we don't have a choice, we need to demand a livable planet. And we don't trust anyone who says it's too late to fix the climate crisis, because the reality is we can imagine a healthy future, so don't tell us that we're all screwed. Does it give I just want to speak in Dutch right away. It actually gives me a really different feeling. Do you have that too? So words are powerful. Be very careful which words you use, and look at the words that your organization has been using to describe futures. Especially when you know that many people feel quite hopeless when they think about that future. And you may be one of them. I am actually also one of them sometimes when I look at the news. But you can work with that. So the hopelessness can also be a source for new inspiration, for creativity, to make things better in a different way. But we definitely, and I totally agree with Rob, we need to find new ways to do that. So I think Einstein once said that we cannot fix or find solutions for our problems in the same way we were thinking as in which we created them. We need to think differently, and we need to level up in that way. So I'm looking for places where they are doing that right now as a way to inspire myself. And a few years ago, I went to the MIT Media Lab, which is a place where the brightest minds, they come together, designers, but scientists, engineers, IT specialists, everything is working alongside each other, which I find very inspiring. They say we are anti-disciplinary. We don't think in disciplines, it's just not interesting, because you cannot even approach the problems of our time in disciplines. So find people that are different. And what they do is they ask their investors, give us time, give us your money, of course, give us time, give us a year, and then come back. Trust us. So this is a combination of money, time, and trust. And in this laboratory experimental place, they find the most beautiful solutions for incredible problems, for incredibly difficult problems, for complex problems. And what I find interesting about it is, of course, we cannot recreate MIT Media Lab everywhere. But what we can do is, for example, create places within our large organizations where people can actually do this, can experiment for you, can take the longer route. So is there a place in your organizations to maybe do that? Are there people who would be really suitable for this type of work, who are now currently in the midst of a lot of to-do lists and short-term tasks? Find them and maybe help them. I'm going to look at my phone for the time. Oh, perfect. The first reflective question I'm going to give you, without asking you to answer it, is which assumptions cloud your judgment in that future? And how may this affect your role? Something that I've heard from a lot of people in technology is that they think technology will be the solution. How does that affect your role and the choices that you make? That may be an interesting one to bring along in these days. So the second practical, but also more philosophical topic I wanted to address today is persisting that distraction. So who do we want to be in that future? Who do we want to be? And what I do is, with my work, I also am looking for time. Like, how can we make more time for the long term? And one of those ways is by looking at planning literature. You probably have also read some books about planning wisely, like this book, or like you probably have worked with this with these axes by Eisenhower about what is important and what is urgent. So I love this quote because he actually says there are two kinds of problems: the urgent and the important. And the urgent are never important, and the important are never urgent. And when I actually really started looking at this in my own schedule, I noticed that my whole week as a researcher consisted of urgent tasks, whilst the work that I need to be doing is working on articles, working on books, which takes a lot of time and is really not urgent at all. I actually went a step further, and I thought, you know what? If I'm gonna speak on stages about time, I need to go into that myself as well. So, from the last couple of years, I actually made the deal with myself at the end of the year. In the new year, I'm not going to do extra sports or do great diets or something. I'm going to focus on more time for important things in my life, like writing that book. And it was so interesting because I've never failed as hard as I did in those years. It's so difficult. Our systems are designed for the short term. We focus also on email, on phone calls, on just making everything happening right now. It's incredibly difficult to really make time for that other pace. So how do we balance that? Because I see that I'm not the only one. I saw some people smiling a bit when I said that. So how do we focus on that long term? And how can we let the speed that's incredibly necessary sometimes also speak with the slowness? How can that collide with each other, align? And I love to always say this. So I'm of course a futurist, and people also sometimes assume that I would be telling you glitzy science fiction scenarios about fast futures. And I'm actually going to tell you the opposite. I just read this book, The Essentialist, and it's about how can you spend your time wisely. And they say in this book there's one chapter devoted to an activity that I was really surprised about. And it's actually the activity that helps us guard our highest priority, and that is to be able to set priorities. Guess what it is? In the back, please. Guess what it is? Which activity? Doing nothing? Sleeping. That's it. Oh, I said, sorry, you're in the front. So I find this hilarious that there's in this productivity book a chapter on sleeping, how incredibly important that is, to be rested. Because if you're rested enough, it doesn't matter if you need 5 hours of sleep or 8, but if you're rested enough, you are able to make better choices today. It's so incredibly important, and we seem to have forgotten, at least I did. Another book that really fascinates me is Subtract by Lydie Klotz. And in this book he says, often when we're changing, for example, we're in a merger, or we're changing our course as a company or organization, we often really add a lot of stuff to be able to do that, like a task force, people, projects. And he says, what if you don't? So what if you minimize everything that you do? And if you change, make sure that you actually exclude things, that you stop with things. Because we love adding, and we don't like stopping things because it feels as failure. So the question I would love to bring in here is really simple. And sometimes these simple questions are actually really, really useful. What matters to you? So if you persist that distraction, if you focus on that long term, what matters to you? Personally, I'm always really interested in what matters to your organization. And I think this is when I work a lot with leaders and how they create their visions. This is an incredibly important question because we often ask this personally, but we forget to ask it for our organization or make that connection. Like, we're all humans working in organizations, trying to do better things, often. So if you connect it a bit more, what happens? And then my last part. I looked at the time. Reality can be quite stubborn, because when we start working with that future and we have narrated beautiful stories that are personal but also more systemic and are felt by your organization, what happens next? So often when I try to find answers, I look at science fiction, actually. And what I do is I look at what are these movies about? What are these series about? What do they tell us about our collective fears? And what I have noticed over the years by doing that is that when I look at science fictions like 2012 with a big, New York was flooded by water, I never actually am losing any sleep over it. I look at it, I'm interested, also from a professional perspective, and then I move on with my life. Until I started watching Black Mirror. If you haven't watched it yet, it's a series created by a group of really creative directors and producers. And they have created a series of science fictions that is actually not as far away as, it's not very far from your bed, so to speak. And I was actually struck by it from the first episode of that series. You can find it on Netflix. And this first episode, it's about the Prime Minister of the UK. I had to stop it. It was so incredibly uncomfortable. And I thought, why do I have to stop this? What is going on here? And I sometimes felt a bit of that unease, but not like that. So if you're still a newbie to Black Mirror, watch it and think of what I said. Curious if you're going to stop it too. This is an episode that I didn't stop. This one is called Nosedive, and it's about a woman in a world where everybody was rating her, like this review culture extra large. And if you get bad ratings, your life will be, you will lose all your privileges. So that's an episode that was easy to watch. And what I learned from looking at Black Mirror is that that future is not just a utopia. It's not just a dystopia. It's actually the world in between. It's that gray area where we're all just trying to do something. And often things fail. Sometimes things succeed unexpectedly. And that's kind of life. And what I love about that idea is that, okay, if you're aware of that, and often we create scenarios, if you think back of this future cone, where we also work with that normative future in our visions, we actually could take an extra step in looking at, okay, what are we telling there? And can it maybe be a little bit more uneasy? Because often those normative stories are as if those futures have already happened and they're amazing. Everything is like, especially at the government, they have a bit of a tendency to create also images in which everybody is happy-go-lucky, but there's quite a long process in between. What is going on there? What are the, in Dutch, beren op de weg, the bears on the road? What are the things that may go terribly wrong? Because if you bring your attention to this uneasiness, it suddenly can become something that you can work with instead of something that you need to stay away from. And you can actually make that discomfort a tool to work with. And this, I also connect the question to this one, and I'm actually happy that I don't have to ask, because often it takes quite a while for people to also have the courage to think about, okay, what is uneasy in my organization about that future? So which uncomfortable topics earn more of your time and attention? And I would really advise you to start working with that question. What are the things that you don't want to know? For example, if you're currently one of the biggest leaders in your field, what could happen that it won't be the case anymore? And also maybe on a personal level, it can be interesting to research that. What could be something that needs more of your time? Because often it translates to the work floor. We're not that disconnected at all. We're really connected in that way. So that was my final, hopefully useful, practical tool. I told you in a nutshell about, think about those ideas that you have about the future, also to resist falling into this pitfall of that probable future, because it's just you on repeat. Continuously ask yourself what matters. And something very concrete that you can do there is every Monday morning, for example, or Friday at the end of your workday, check in what is important in this week. It actually changes your week. And then, in the end, cultivate faster the discomfort. Ask questions, those fundamental questions that Rob also pointed out, how important those are. Don't take things for granted, not your own assumptions, and also not the stories that we tell each other. And look what happens with your own creativity when you do that. Thanks a lot. And if you want to connect and continue the conversation, find me on LinkedIn. I love it to have conversations there as well. And I'm curious about the questions of the people in the back. Thanks.
Thank you, Tessa. I have questions, but I'm going to, because I don't know how much time we have for questions, or 4 minutes, not so long. So I'm happy to take questions immediately from the audience, especially from the back, if there are any right now. Okay, well, let me start the ball rolling. Really, no questions, everyone? Everyone's completely happy with the tools. They feel like they're prepped up now to deal with the future. You have a question? Okay, let's take yours first. What's your name? Where AMS-IX?
Yeah, I'm Jan from AMS-IX.
Where you set up?
Because you're mentioning all the time the future, and I'm just wondering, how about the past? Because, you know, you can look into the future. You said some, you showed some examples, but isn't the history also leading us to the future? And how are you coping with that as a teacher, or as a professor, or as a doctor?
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, also as a teacher. Yeah, definitely. The connection is super important. So I always explain also my work that I'm like an historian. Historians tell stories about what has happened, and they can be sometimes factual, but often they're also stories. For example, about the Golden Age. I learned about that in high school, and I was actually proud. And then only a few years later, I learned, there's nothing to be proud of, because this Golden Age was just for a few people very golden, and for many people it wasn't. And actually, this is also happening in the future. So we need to learn from what has happened, and also need to learn that the past can actually also change. And the future can be similar. So for me, it's indeed really important to connect the two. And then especially for me to remove the fear around the future and help people be more decisive today. Because if you're less fearful and less hopeless, then things can change. Yeah.
Okay. And about in terms of how we affect that change, I'm thinking of organizations. What are the concrete ways in which organizations can help us think more long term? You mentioned, for instance, creating like these islands of experimentation, maybe within a company. Can you give a couple more examples?
Yeah. So what I, for example, do myself is I bring in a place where every Thursday during lunch I offer a place to do nothing. And just have conversation about what's going on in the world or in people themselves.
Do you have hummus at that conversation?
Yeah, I facilitate that.
Good.
Yeah. And I actually, what I find interesting about it to see is that it really helps people to be better at just doing the fast stuff. So if they slow down a bit, then suddenly they can also do faster stuff. So that's one of the examples. But you can, for example, also think about visions, how you create them as an organization. Does the leadership team do that? Or is it something, a conversation within a whole company? And that can be really useful. And also not just make it one exercise for just a month, for example, because it needs to be done, but something that is for like every year, through the year.
And for other CEOs, other leaders out there, or managers of teams of people who are thinking, oh my goodness, slowing people down, that's not what my remit is. If anything, we need to speed up. What can you say? What is your call to action for them? I mean, because they also have the daily hassles of, their inbox filling up, their evaluations, upward evaluations, downward, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. That's like a choice you make? Like, do you keep things on repeat and keep it by the same, or do you make space, time? Do you give it money to create something else within your organization? And that's just a strategic question. And it's not just about slowing down. I think it's also creating more depth. Can you sometimes just really focus on what you need to be doing and be also critical about it? This is not something that's easily done on a schedule for a meeting that has to be done in an hour online.
I think that's great. I think by talking about the depth, you're reframing the pitch that those managers could then give to their higher ups, if you like. Say,
yeah.
It's not about slowing down, it's about more depth.
Yeah,
I think that's great. Okay, any more questions out there? Yeah, one at the back. Yeah, let's take that, and then we have to wrap it up. Yes, you can. We're running out of time. I just got that. Sorry. Yes, what's your name? Where are you from?
My name is Natalie. I'm from Bretten, from Amsterdam, I guess. My question is about the uncomfortable situations and uncomfortable questions that we face. So how could you give a couple of examples, please, and explain specifically how would one embrace them and turn them into something bigger and useful, and not just something that we try to ignore or not maybe face even. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, what type of question can you think about? These are often related to also the assumptions that we have. For example, something that Rob showed. Are you able to ask questions? For many people have the assumption that asking questions is stupid, which actually is quite fundamental, because if you don't, then you really miss an opportunity to create stuff or create new things. But there's also something else, of course. Like, there's often in organizations, in deep democracy, they call it the sharks. There's always sharks that are the stories that we don't want to really talk about. For example, who is speaking and who isn't. Based on what parameters are choices made. So which choices do you make for others? Are you actually doing the things that you should be doing? These are questions that are not so easy and sometimes difficult. For example, also, what do we have to stop? What is not working? These questions, if you start bringing them in, and it can be small like that, what should we stop every meeting? See what happens? That could be a start. And from there, you can maybe go into the more sharky area of the things we don't really like to talk about because they're a taboo or unethical or, it could be all kinds of stuff. Is that helpful?
You can continue the conversation afterwards. So,
yeah,
thank you very much. Big round of applause, please, for Tessa Cramer.